Okay, I think we're ready to roll. Are we ready to roll? Are we rolling online? Oh yes, I see the red light. All right, got the thumbs up from Justin. All right. Good afternoon, everyone. Thank you so much for joining us here in person in Encina Hall and also online. I think we have about 150 or so people who are also joining us online. It's my pleasure as, I should say, my name is Catherine Stoner. I'm the Director of the Center on Democracy Development and the Rule of Law. I'm also a Senior Fellow here at the Freeman Spogli Institute. And I'm a political scientist, and I also have a courtesy of a Senior Fellow appointment at the Hoover Institution here at Stanford. It's my pleasure to first wish my predecessor, the Dowager Director of CDDRL, Francis Fukuyama, a happy birthday. 40 years old again today. And we have a gift for you, which is this talk this afternoon. It's wonderful to welcome to Stanford Ambassador Shirin Tahir-Kheli, who is a Senior Fellow at the Johns Hopkins School of Advanced International Studies Foreign Policy Institute. She has a long and very distinguished career in the United States government service, beginning in 1982 as a member of the policy planning staff in the United States Department of State under President Reagan. She has moved on and served under 3 American presidents. From March 2003 to April 2005, she served as Special Assistant to the President and Senior Director for Democracy, Human Rights, and International Operations at the National Security Council. From 2004 to 2006, she also served as the key US official in the formulation of US policy toward United Nations reform. I can say my neighbor, actually, friend and colleague, Secretary Condoleezza Rice, also appointed her as senior advisor for women's empowerment in the Bush administration. She set up and oversaw the work of the Women Leaders Working Group and spearheaded the State Department Initiative for Women's Justice. Ambassador Tahir-Kheli was also a research professor of international relations at Johns Hopkins SAIS, and she served as the founding director there of the South Asia program from 1999 to 2002. She's the author of Before the Age of Prejudice, a Muslim woman's national security work with 3 American presidents, among other books and monographs. Ambassador Tahir-Kheli has dedicated her efforts beyond women's empowerment also to finding areas of agreement between India and Pakistan. So she does not shy away from big challenges that could change their relationship to one of more productive peace. She's also been the chair of the BAL USA group, comprising therefore senior Indian, Pakistani, and US participants that is geared toward influencing policy toward cooperation. Shirin is going to, or I should say Ambassador Tahir-Kheli is going to come up and speak a little bit about the series that was started at Johns Hopkins in 2015, the Condoleezza Rice Women Who Inspire Lecture Series, named for the 66th Secretary of State, Condoleezza Rice, here in the front row. Ambassador Tahir-Kheli will also give a more formal and thorough introduction of our inspiring woman today, Obi Felten, founder and CEO of Flourish Labs, and also Secretary Rice, who will say a few words before the conversation between Shirin and Obi begins. Thanks. Welcome.
Thank you very much, Dr. Stoner, for that. And I have to say that it is indeed a great pleasure for me to be here today to introduce the series to a different audience in this hybrid format. And I want to note that this is a series named for the 66th Secretary of State, Condoleezza Rice, which is housed at Johns Hopkins University. But we are delighted to have in partnership for today's event, the Center on Democracy Development and the Rule of Law. And so I want to begin on behalf of SAIS to thank all the colleagues, Frank Fukuyama in particular, and all of his colleagues who have really helped make this. They undertook the effort so cheerfully, Frank. I really appreciate the work they've done in order to make it possible, and also to Secretary Rice's office and Josie and others who made it possible for us to be together today. At a personal level, this evening brings together two bookends of my life in the US government. It was a call from Frank Fukuyama in 1982 that got me from academia to the policy planning staff, which was my first job in the US government. And it was a call from then National Security Advisor Condoleezza Rice in 2003 that took me back into government and the National Security Council staff as a special assistant to the president for democracy, human rights, and international operations. So I want to thank you both for these two opportunities, which actually basically changed my life. Tonight is the 9th event for the Women Who Inspire lecture series. The idea behind the series is to offer conversations with amazing women and using the power of example to motivate students to become pioneers in their chosen professions. Bringing two exceptional high-profile women each year to explore different facets of leadership, the program features conversations with trailblazing women from a variety of career and life paths. Thus, we felt completely appropriate to name the series for the 6th Secretary of State, Condoleezza Rice. It is also a great pleasure for me to know that in the audience, we have the former Secretary of the United States for the Air Force and also for the US Space Force, Barbara Barrett, an early supporter of this series and a constant source of inspiration. She's indeed a woman who inspires, and so thank you for being such an important founding member of the series, Barbara. Condoleezza Rice needs no introduction, especially here at Stanford, where she's director of the Hoover Institution and the Thomas and Barbara Stevenson Fellow on Public Policy. She's also a founding partner of Rice, Hadley, Gates, and Manuel, the international strategic consulting firm. Secretary Rice served as a 66th Secretary of State from 2005 to 2009, the second woman and the first Black woman to hold the post. Just prior to that, she was the very first woman to serve as National Security Advisor to the President from 2001 to 2005. Of course, you know that she served previously as Provost of Stanford from 93 to 99 and a member of the National Security Council from 1989 to 91. She has been a professor at Stanford since 1981, winning 2 prestigious awards for teaching. She's an author of note, a football enthusiast, was one of 2 women admitted as members of the Augusta National Golf Club in 2012. She has lent her energy and name to bettering access to quality education and access to music education. Another first that I know of is that she's the only woman, or man for that matter, who, when serving as National Security Advisor to the President, played an entire concert at the White House with Yo-Yo Ma. So it is my pleasure to ask Secretary Condoleezza Rice to offer her remarks. Thank you.
Well, thank you very much, Shirin, and thank you to all of you here and to those who are joining us remotely. I just want to say to Shirin, the only reason that Frank called you and that I called you is we recognize talent. And you indeed have served extraordinarily well your country in so many ways and so many opportunities. I just have to tell you one story because it actually relates a bit to women. And that is that Shirin was the force behind the building with the help of American nonprofits of a women's hospital in Basra in Iraq. And it was her idea because this was an area that had had extremely high incidences of maternal and infant cancers. and where people could not get treatment. And despite all of the difficulties and troubles, that hospital is operating today. And I just want you to know that this woman has had a huge impact, not just on the United States and on what our government has done, but on the lives of women across the world. That is why I think this series, which I first talked about with Barbara Verrett, is important. It's an opportunity to bring people together to hear from inspiring women. We've had quite a wonderful list of inspiring women, and we have one such person today. Obi, I'm so excited that you are here and look forward to hearing from you. It's important because, as I often said when I was Secretary of State, when you find a society that does not recognize the talents of women, you usually have a dangerous society. When I am asked, what can you do to make the world a better place? I often say, let me empower women, and I can guarantee you that we will get purchase on a number of the issues that are bedeviling the world as a whole. If you want to do something about population explosion, empower women. They will not have their first child at 13, and they will not have 12 children. If you want to do something about human trafficking, empower women, and they will not be trafficked into brothels in Southeast Asia and in Eastern Europe, and indeed even into the United States. If you want to do something to empower a whole village, give a woman a microloan or a way to start a business, and you will enrich the entire community. And oh, by the way, you will change also the attitudes of men, because after all, those empowered women have husbands and sons and brothers. And so much of the work that we have tried to do over the last years in democracy, and I'm here have to point out the importance of this center on democracy that Catherine, my neighbor in my community, is the head of. Everything that we try to do to build stronger, more democratic, more just societies can only be done if we empower women. So it's not just the empowerment of women, but it's also the celebration of women. Because very often the stories of how women came to be who they are involve overcoming stereotypes about what women can and cannot do. It involves overcoming those who just don't quite believe that women can do that. And it requires a kind of attitude, which my parents once described as, oh, just go and do it. They said that well before Just Do It was a moniker for a well-known shoe company. And so the connection between empowering women and celebrating women is exactly that. But the same things that we see in those women who are willing to be empowered in societies where their voices have not been heard, those same characteristics are often seen in women who succeed and rise to the top in societies where their voices can be heard. And so celebrating women becomes also a part of empowering women. I'm really very pleased, and Shirin will give a proper introduction to Obi Felten, but there's something very special about what you do, because we also know that the issues of mental health these days are not just on the front pages of the newspaper, they are in the front of people's minds. And it's because it's a very difficult time for everyone, from students to family members, to pay attention to this very important element of mental health. And you have come up with a very innovative and creative way to deal with this very old problem. That in and of itself speaks to your power as an entrepreneur, but it also speaks to your heart. And that's why I'm so grateful that you are here today. So I'm looking forward to this discussion, to the conversation, to your telling us about how you came to be who you are. And I'm looking forward to many more years of introducing women who we should celebrate. I don't know how many more years, but I hope many, despite the fact that Shirin told you that I've been a faculty member at Stanford for more than 40 years. They hired me at 11. Thank you very much.
As I mentioned earlier, that the Women Who Inspire lecture series seeks to highlight how women are reshaping the world, confronting global challenges and blazing trails across all walks of life that improve the human condition. This evening's speaker absolutely meets that criteria. So thank you, Obi, for being here. I also want to take this opportunity to say that this is one of those, in reaching out to you, I was able to use the subject line on my email, which I have always wanted to use. And that is, I wrote, I am Kazim Tahir-Kheli's mother, because I knew that way you would respond immediately. So thank you for that as well. Obi Felten is the founder and CEO of Flourish Labs, a startup combining cutting-edge mental health, science, and technology to foster flourishing and good mental health. Previously, Obi was head of getting moonshots ready for contact with the real world at X, formerly Google X, Alphabet's Moonshot Factory and Innovation Lab. At X, Obi worked on cutting-edge technology projects, such as internet from balloons, air delivery by drone, and sustainable energy shortage using molten salt. Most recently, Obi founded and led Amber, a project using brain-based biomarkers and machine learning to measure anxiety and depression. Obi was director of consumer marketing for Google in Europe, Middle East, and Africa, launching and growing Google Maps, Chrome, and Android from 0 to hundreds of millions of users. She founded Campus, Google's space for tech entrepreneurs. Before Google, Obi set up the e-commerce business of a major UK retailer, working as a strategy consultant, and led eToys.com expansion to Germany during the first .com boom, though she reminds me that that turned out to be unsuccessful. Obi is an independent director of Springer Nature, a global academic and educational publisher. She's an advisor for mental health at the Wellcome Trust, one of the largest funders of scientific research, and Chelsea and Westminster NHS Trust Best for You Youth Mental Health Initiative. She's an advocate for women, for people of color, and other underrepresented groups in technology. At X, she founded the Diversity and Inclusion Team, supported several employee resource groups, and served on the leadership team for women of Alphabet in the Bay Area. She mentors female startup founders and leaders getting ready for board service. Obi grew up in Berlin and saw the wall come down. She has a BA in philosophy and psychology from Oxford University, lives in California with her husband and 2 children. Casper, welcome. Nice to have you here. And is, in addition to all the great professional things she does, she also is a sports enthusiast. And so you cover a wide range, my friends. So thank you for being here. And we feel very fortunate to have you here to talk about what makes Obi Felten Obi Felten. Thank you.
Well, hello, everyone. It's really wonderful to be here. I feel very humble to be following 2 such incredible women with others in the audience. So really, it's really an absolute honor and pleasure to be here. So I've spent the last decade, 2 decades plus in the technology industry. And I think that's one of the areas we all know where women don't always rise to the top. So, and I feel very fortunate that I have been able to make an impact at some incredible companies. So what I want to do is share some of the lessons that I've learned which actually are largely around failure and how you overcome it and how you sort of persevere and get through and how you take lessons from failure, because that's a topic that's, I think is really important. But before I dive into that, Shirin just gave my official bio, but I thought I'd give you a couple of the sort of backstories to how I got here where I am. So I did grow up in Berlin, and Berlin was a divided city for most of my childhood. In fact, I spent a year in the US as an exchange student when I was 16 in 1988 to 89, telling absolutely everybody that the wall was never going to come down. Now, my only excuse was this was upstate New York, and news of perestroika did not reach upstate New York, either the newspapers or the television news. And so I came back in the autumn of 1989 to be surprised by this absolutely huge transformative event. And so that's like me with a bunch of other kids, school children standing on the wall in November. And then I went to Oxford, and I went to Oxford to do philosophy and psychology, which everybody told me was an absolutely useless degree. I was never going to get a job with it. I did it because I was interested and passionate about it. And it turns out 20 years later, I found myself working on artificial intelligence. And if you work on AI, having a solid grounding in ethics and in neuroscience, I would argue is actually incredibly useful. So you never know, follow your passions rather than what might be useful or deemed useful at the time. I did get a job in London. I met my future husband in Oxford. So I moved to London, got married, made that my home. And that's actually where I met Kaz. We worked together at this consulting firm called Mitchell Madison, which was a startup consulting firm. There was a bunch of partners who had founded it. And this was the second half of the 90s. So financial services companies, who were mostly our clients, were asking themselves what they should do about this new thing called the internet. So that's actually a real presentation. The title of the presentation was, Should Commercial Unions Sell Insurance Online? Which was a real question for their board in 1997. And now it sounds funny, but we did a whole series of those projects. And so when my friends went to business school in 1999, I said, I'm going into a startup. And so I interviewed with all of the E's that were coming into Europe at the time. So eBay, eTrade, eToys. And I chose eToys and became a product manager in this online toy store that at the time was as big as Amazon. And convinced them to let me not just help them set up the UK, but then let me take them into Germany. So I set up the German company, hired all the people, and we were about a week away from shipping our first toys when the board back in California decided we were losing so much money that we had to stop the European expansion. And so I had to fire all of those people that I had just convinced to leave great jobs in retail, some with pension schemes and so on, to embark on this e-commerce dream. And I was, I was 28. I was totally out of my depth, but it was a formative experience in my life to have such a big failure so early in my career. And what I learned is that I'm still afraid of failure. I don't think that ever goes away, but I know how to get through it. And I know there's always a door to the next thing. And that what's most important is to take care of the people in that situation. So in this case, my team, helping them find all their jobs. Many of them went to eBay, which was exploding in Germany by this point. And so I came out of this experience in 2001. I loved e-commerce. Nobody was funding startups in 2001, at least not in Europe. So I ended up working in large retailers in the UK, taking them online. And that turned out to be a soul-destroying experience because 20 years ago, retailers did not think that e-commerce was going to be a thing. So, we kept spending money on store refurbishment programs, and I would say, why are we doing that, And so I was rescued from my miserable existence by a company called Google that had just set up an office in London. And Google at the time was still kind of a startup. The London office was 100 people. Globally, there were about 5,000. And I joined them in marketing because I don't have a computer science degree. So product was not really an option. You have to have a computer science degree, at least in those days at Google. And I was hired by an amazing woman called Lorraine Tuhill, who ran marketing in Europe. And she said, yes, you've never done marketing before. It doesn't really matter. We'll teach you the marketing. You know about online products. That's what we care about. And so I joined Google at a time that would turn out to be this period of extraordinary growth. And we would launch new offices. We would launch new products like Android and Chrome. And I got to be part of that journey of growing them to hundreds of thousands of users, millions of users over time. And then about 9 years ago, another great Google woman called Megan Smith, who ended up in Obama's White House as the CTO of the United States, she connected me with a guy in an obscure little group called Google X and called Astro Teller. And she said, you should talk to him. And I knew they were working on self-driving cars, but nobody knew what else they were working on. And so I met with him and he told me about these inspiring moonshot projects they're working on. And then I asked him a whole load of very practical questions, like, is it legal to fly balloons over countries? Have you talked to any governments about this? Are you going to partner with telcos or compete with them? Do you have a business plan for any of these projects? And he looked at me and he said, those are really good questions. We're all engineers making the balloons fly, et cetera, and the cars drive. Why don't you come and help us with those questions? So I ended up in California 9 years ago as the sort of first person that was looking at everything, de-risking everything that wasn't technology of these sort of Google X projects. And so that's how I came here. And I was particularly inspired by the balloon project because I'd seen how much difference the internet could make in my work, particularly in the Middle East and Africa when I was running marketing in those regions for Google. And then we already met, like Shirin mentioned the project. I'll talk a little bit about the project that led me to my current company at the end. So, but now let's sort of dive into the ideas of behind this talk. So when I was a kid, I asked lots of questions. I asked a lot of why questions, and I asked a lot of why not questions, and I asked a lot of what if questions, which often people found really irritating, especially when I kept asking those as an adult. And when I got to X, it was actually really inspiring to be in a team where people did ask questions like, what if we could do this, right? So what if we could make a car that drives itself? Or what if we could change the way that we deliver goods? So why do we have to send a large van to deliver a parcel? What if we could do that by drone? Or what if we could connect the internet, give people the internet via balloons rather than fixed cell towers? Or what if we could store wind and solar so that we could make it dispatchable and available whenever people needed it, not just when the wind blows? And we did this in molten salt vats, very large vats of molten salt. That's now a company actually that's spun out of X. Oh, it's not working. What if you could measure people's glucose in their tear fluid instead of having them prick their finger to check their blood glucose? And what if we could make seawater into a carbon neutral fuel? So about half of these projects survived, the others didn't. So the failure rate is pretty high, and that's partly intentional, right? We talk about taking moonshots for a reason, that we want to address very large problems in the world with the help of technology. And these are radical solutions. So not something that is just an incremental change to what has been done before, but actually real change. You think it works now? Great, thank you. Many of the projects you would have noticed were actually grounded in this, what I think is one of the greatest lists of problems that has been made by the UN, when they came up with the Sustainable Development Goals. And I think that's one of the things that if you work in technology is incredibly important, is actually to remain grounded in the problem that you're trying to solve. Now, not all moonshots are technology moonshots. This is actually one that I'm really proud of having been involved in. So in 2018, I joined the board of Springer Nature, which is publisher of Nature in about 3,000 journals. And at the time, they were already pretty committed to open access publishing and making papers available freely to everyone. But they said, oh, we can't do it with Nature. And I said, why? And why not? And what if we did do it? What kind of signal would that send to the rest of the industry? And it helped that the chairman of the board also kept asking those questions. So the two of us sort of, kept chipping away at it. And last December, Nature actually opened up the option for authors so they can pay upfront, which means their paper can be read for free by everyone across the whole world, which I think is really amazing because it means science can be disseminated much more broadly than if it's behind a paywall. So if an organization like Nature, which is venerable, over 100 years old can change, then I really believe that any institution can change. But what it comes down to, it's really about the culture. And how do you have a culture that allows you to learn from mistakes and move on? So these are some of the lessons that I've learned in my career. So the first one is all around focusing on the problem. So I worked with a lot of wonderful engineers in my life, and engineers can sometimes fall in love with the technology and forget that the technology is just a tool to solve a problem. So the best example that I have for my X days is Google Glass, which is really very cool technology. But when we first launched the prototype, it became clear very quickly that it wasn't solving a real problem for anyone. That taking hands-free videos of your kids or seeing your tweets come by was kind of fun, but not enough to compel someone to want to wear a computer on their face, which frankly made them look a little silly. But then what happened was that people were starting to use glass for all sorts of applications in the workspace, like in warehouses or in doctor's offices and in assembly of airplanes and so on. They didn't care the battery was terrible. They didn't care that the user interface was clunky and so on. They found it useful. And so that's an example where unless you let your prototype out into the world before it's ready, we would have never learned that lesson. And I think that was a really important lesson from that sort of failure project. So, which brings me to the next point, which is we have a big problem with embracing failure, right? Actually, when I was in Europe, we would often look across the Silicon Valley and there would be this myth amongst European entrepreneurs that in Silicon Valley, people who failed were celebrated. And I got here and I learned that's not at all the case. Everybody's trying to succeed here and make their company a unicorn, etc. But I think what is maybe a little bit more baked into the culture here is this sort of readiness to embrace and accept the failure and accept that that's part of the process. I love this quote, which is ascribed to Edison. He probably never said it, but it's still a great quote that, it's not, as long as you keep trying, you haven't really failed. But what does that mean? What is important is that we need to learn as fast as possible. And one of the sort of images that we used at X was this image of a monkey. So imagine you want to train a monkey to recite Shakespeare while standing on a pedestal. What do you work on first? Training the monkey or building the pedestal? Now, it's very tempting to start with the pedestal. Like when we make a to-do list, we often gravitate towards the things that we know how to do so that we can tick them off and we get sort of some sense of progress. Our investors are impressed, our boss is impressed, and so on. But what if in the second year of your project, you find out it's impossible to teach the monkey English, let alone recite Shakespeare? Then you've wasted your time on a really beautiful pedestal. So we ended up with this sort of principle that we said, monkey first, you always have to work on the hardest thing first and then figure out the rest later. The other lesson that I learned was that all of us, when we begin a project, we set success criteria. So we have this beautiful vision of what the world looks like when we succeed. And that's great. And that's really important to inspire yourself, to inspire the team, to inspire others around. But I would argue it's just as important to set kill criteria early on. So how do you know when you're not going to be succeeding? How do you know when it's time to call quits, which is one of the most difficult things for entrepreneurs or anyone even inside a company? And one of my favorite projects at X was called Foghorn. And the idea was to make a renewable fuel by extracting CO2 from seawater, combining it with renewable hydrogen to make a fuel you could burn in any car. So we don't have to wait until every car has become electric. It was a beautiful vision. I loved it. And the team made really good technical progress. So on this picture here, you can see the bucket of ocean in the back, and then you can see our machine. And then you can see Kathy Hannon, who's the project lead, with a little fuel of sea fuel that I still have on my desk today. So the technology kind of worked. But the team had also set themselves a goal to make the fuel at the same price as any other oil-based fuel. And you can probably guess what this is. It's the oil price. So we started the project in 2012 at around $100 a barrel. The profitability was a little shaky, but believable. And when the oil price went down to $30, the team came to me and said we should shut this project down, because even if there's a price on carbon, we should do other things first. So you could argue we were just too early. People are now talking about direct air capture of carbon again, because it's becoming more and more pressing that we actually do have to remove carbon from the atmosphere. But it was a really good example of a team having very clear criteria of like what would make the project succeed or fail. So we shut the project down. I actually gave them a bonus for that decision. HR said, what, you're giving them a bonus for failing? And I said, no, I'm giving them a bonus because they very maturely came up with this framework of how to evaluate their own project and then shut it down. So it actually went out as a Harvard business case study because they thought this was quite a remarkable story. And we also published all of the sort of results, like the cost model and so on, in academic papers so that the world could benefit from the work we did. The next point is about how do you know that your thing is going to succeed in the real world. So Shirin mentioned my kind of funny sounding job title. I was head of getting moonshots ready for contact with the real world. And people would sort of laugh and say, is that for real? And I said, yes, actually, because it was very descriptive of what I did, of getting these projects out of the lab and into the real world. And many of them actually started in real academic labs, right? So this project actually started at Stanford. So self-driving car team at Google was two teams that came together from Carnegie Mellon and from Stanford, who'd been fierce rivals in various DARPA challenges before they came together. And that's a really good example of where they took it out of the lab and onto the road, quite literally, to the point where, you know, there was a blind man who was able to take a car ride in Austin in a car that completely drove itself and was fully autonomous, which was something that just even 5 or 10 years earlier, people had thought was not going to happen in our lifetime. And now if you're in Phoenix, you can actually hail a Waymo cab, and it's coming to San Francisco soon too, I'm told. The last project I did at X was in the mental health space. And this is where sort of two strands of my life came together. I studied psychology originally at Oxford, neuroscience. And then I had several friends and family members who really suffered from mental health problems. But in all of their cases, I've been very lucky. No one's ever killed themselves, recovered, and ended up flourishing. But I got interested in this question of like, how can we give better mental health to more people? How can we better measure it? Because it's very imperfect the way we measure it today. So with my neuroscience background, we started a project which was actually kicked off by a neuroscientist, not me, a proper neuroscientist with a PhD in neuroscience, and an electrical engineer. And they came up with this idea of like, what if we use brainwaves and we measure brainwaves, and then we use machine learning to interpret those data, which are very complex, to see whether we could better measure anxiety and depression. And it turns out the science works. So, you know, there's a number of studies, which we also replicated in our own studies, and you can see the shape of the brainwave changes. So for instance, if someone plays a game and you measure their brainwave, at the moment when they find out whether they've won or they've lost, somebody who's very depressed, the brainwave is shortened, it's blunted. So the response looks different than in someone who's not depressed. So we were on our path to build a medical device, which I read a paper that takes about 17 years from innovation in the lab to it actually being in, you know, accepted clinical in practice. And we were about to start our third clinical study when COVID hit and everything, you know, was ground to a halt. And a few months in, we actually decided to shut the project down, and we gave away everything. So we open sourced the EEG device. So that's now on GitHub. We published our machine learning methods. And we also published all the user research that we had done with students and with clinicians working in the student mental health field. On the side, I did a pro bono project called Heroes Health. This was the brainchild of a researcher and emergency room physician at the University of North Carolina. And he was one of our academic collaborators on AMBER. And he called me last March and he said, I'm in the ER, people are dying in front of our eyes, and it's really having a really bad impact onto our colleagues. I want to build an app that helps healthcare workers track their own mental health during COVID and then connects them with resources at their local hospital. And he called me and he said, I need a tech partner. I don't know how to build an app. And I said, yes, on the call, like without even thinking about how I was going to do it. And then convinced Google Cloud to support it. So Google did it as a pro bono project. We had about 30 engineers from across the company donating their own personal time and 20% time. And we built this app in 3 months. It's a very basic app, but you know, the UNC team managed to roll it out to about 14 hospitals. And it showed that you could measure mental health with kind of very simple methods if you're asking people on a daily basis. and then connect them to the help when they actually need it in the moment. And so both of these were kind of prototypes for what I ended up doing. So after 15 years at Google and at X, I left in June to set up my own company, which is probably the most terrifying thing I've ever done in my life. And, you know, my son is here, and like my family questioned quite a lot, like whether this is really the right move. But I decided I want to stay in mental health, and I want to not just do this work on boards, but actually make it the center of my work. And so the company's mission is Flourishing Minds for All, and we're starting with students. And the word choice of flourishing is quite deliberate, because I believe that you can have a serious mental illness and still be flourishing, or you cannot meet diagnostic criteria for a mental illness and be languishing, like so many of us have sort of experienced this feeling of blah during the pandemic. So how can we get more people to flourish is the question that we're looking at. And we're starting with students because the issue is really high with students, and the impact on someone's life if they have mental health problems in college, for instance, is very severe. So about 75% of mental health problems show up under the age of 24. And if people are diagnosed with depression or anxiety, they're very likely to drop out and not come back in. So it has a huge impact on someone's life trajectory. But on the flip side, students are also very open to new solutions that are kind of more radical than what exists. And so what we're working on now is app. It's a self-tracking app for the mind. So imagine it's like a Fitbit, but for your mind. In fact, we integrate Fitbit data. I'll talk about that in a second. But it's not just a technology solution. I've worked in technology all my life. I love technology. It's an amazing lever that helps us solve problems, but it's never the only solution. And I think in mental health, what we're actually missing is some of the human connection. So we want to actually use the technology in order to connect people to real humans. So the way it works is it integrates 2 data streams. Your lived experience that's captured in a questionnaire in the app that we serve up twice a day. And then if people have a wearable, like I'm wearing this Oura Ring or Fitbit or an Apple Watch, we can take sleep data, activity data, and heart rate data, which are good predictors of mental well-being and mental health, and integrate that in. Now, there's hundreds of mental health apps out there. So why would we make another one? Well, we looked at the literature, and actually there's really good evidence that this kind of combination that we're proposing, which is creating self-awareness, and then using the data that you get in your own reports to also connect you with others. And the way that will work is that you can choose 3 people. We share a summary of your status with them, and they get prompted to reach out to you. So the idea is that the help comes to the person when they need it, instead of them having to take action themselves. Because we know that there's lots and lots of barriers to people taking action. And then this kind of peer support idea is actually, there's really good evidence that it works, and that it's not just effective for the person who's getting the support, but it's also effective for the person giving the support. So you kind of get 2 uplifts for one. But what's an open question, what's not been researched, is whether this combination of self-tracking and peer support can have better effects in mental health. So it's been researched in diabetes and cancer with very positive outcomes. But that's the kind of research question that we're tackling together with Manpreet Singh, who's actually a psychiatry professor here at Stanford. So she'll lead an independent study into this. We're building the app with students and for students. And this, so it's only open to kind of trusted testers at the moment. We're getting a lot of feedback. So if any of the students in the room are interested to test it, please come and talk to me about it or look at the website. But the reason we're doing that is because I have a really strong belief, and this is my kind of final point that I want to leave you with, is that we can't build technology in a vacuum. We have to build diverse perspectives into the technology right from the ground up when we're in the kind of earliest design phases. And so that means diversity in terms of gender, in terms of race, in terms of backgrounds. You know, I have had very multidisciplinary teams throughout my entire career, which are hard to manage, right? If you have a bunch of engineers, they agree with each other much more. My last team at X was a neuroscientist, machine learning people, software engineers, hardware engineers, product managers for medical devices, lawyers. They disagreed a lot, which made my job as a manager, you know, orders of magnitude more difficult. But I do believe that if you bring that diversity together, then you get better outcomes in the end. And so I want to leave you with this quote by another amazing woman who frankly probably ran the country while her husband was president. And she says that the future belongs to those who believe in the beauty of their dreams. And I really believe in the beauty of dreams, and that we can use technology to make it whatever we want it to be and help us solve some of these very large problems in the world. Thank you.
Thank you, Obi.
Thank you for having me.
Well, it's for somebody who comes from a very different background in terms of what we've worked at, it's absolutely fascinating to hear your life's experience and, you know, how you are marrying technology with which you're familiar with issues that are sort of so much a reflection of the human condition, health in various varieties. But I wanted to sort of step back a little bit simply because of your experience leading these efforts for Google X. Just at the very basic level to start with, how did you come up with some of these potential exploratory ideas for Google X? Did you sort of have, did the light bulb go off and you said, I'm going to see if this makes sense? I mean, the universe has so many different issues you could pick on. What was the selection process in your mind, and how did you then go about trying to put resources of a big company behind it?
So first of all, I'd like to say none of these were my ideas. In fact, I believe there's no original ideas. All we can do is make ideas grow, shape them, and then somehow make them come to fruition. But X does have a team whose job it is to come up with new X projects. And it's called Rapid Evaluation, the Rapid Eval team. And they do like what the label says, they try and evaluate ideas as quickly as possible. Now, more often that actually means trying to figure out as quickly as possible which ideas don't work, right? So that you can eliminate them. So of the kind of, hundreds of ideas that they would look at, maybe less than 10% even make it to the next stage. And then the next stage is kind of when there would be a fledgling project team put together, where you'd have not just engineers, but also maybe a product manager and others coming in. And I ran that team for a while whenever we started a new project. And it was really hard because you always have more ideas and more projects than you could possibly feed. Even a company with the resources of Google, which was funding Google X's efforts, and even today, Google drives Alphabet's revenues and all these innovation projects. There's never enough. And I actually believe that constraining it is a good thing, that you shouldn't just be starting tons of projects and let them run forever. So this kind of question of how can we cut things down, how can we prune, became very, very important in the portfolio. And for us, there was never a sort of fixed set of criteria. Astra actually refused to make it too fixed. He said there needs to be a little bit of sort of room for maneuver. But ultimately, it did come down to a few things like, are we particularly well suited to work on this problem, right? So do we have the resources and the skills and so on compared to others? So for instance, we would tackle projects that had a large policy aspect, like self-driving cars or the balloon project definitely had huge policy aspects to them, but policy change wasn't the core of it, right? Like technology was the core of it because that was the part that we were really good at. And if a project started tipping where a bigger part of the problem was actually other things like, operational excellence or policy, then that we probably weren't the right team to be working on that anymore. And we would shut it down, even though it was a promising idea.
Mm-hmm. So then what constitutes success? I mean, you have an idea. Mm-hmm. What is the definition of success as you take it forward?
So to me, actually, definition of success is largely, are you moving forward? So are you moving forward in a direction where you're de-risking the problem and you think that it has a greatest chance of actually having the impact that you think that you want, right? And so if you're not moving forward, if you're stagnating, that to me is like a definition of failure. And so success often is kind of this question of momentum, of like experimenting like a scientist, like coming up with a hypothesis, figuring out whether it's going to work in some sort of test in the lab or in the real world, and then moving forward or stopping.
And what percentage of the ideas that came through kind of moved ahead towards some kind of a successful?
Right. Well, it spawned a number of companies, right? So Waymo is probably the most famous one, the self-driving car one, but also Verily, which is in the healthcare space. And then some became companies, like Loon, the Balloon Project became its own company, and then failed in a kind of later stage. So I'm not actually sure what the percentage is. Like, I don't think we actually ever ran the numbers of like all the ideas we looked at, but it would be a very small percentage, right? So the funnel is pretty steep.
And so that was an expectation from the outset that
exactly right.
Clearly, the funnel has to be kind of narrow in order to.
That if we don't set the sights high enough, then we're not being audacious enough.
Right.
So.
In terms of your teams, I assume there were multiple teams because you were dealing with a series of issues. Is there in the composition of the teams? There is an assumption now, I think, should be discarded, but there's still an assumption that in the innovation phase of discovery and so on, women don't loom very large in terms of their presence. Is that reflected in the kind of creative teams that you dealt with, or is it didn't matter? I mean, the genders were evenly divided?
It wasn't evenly divided. I think part of this is, if you have a technology-led company, right, and it was like Google and X were very much engineering-led companies. And so there were initially fewer female engineers, right? Then you'd look at X, we worked a lot on hardware, there's even fewer hardware engineers. And so we started from this like really bad point, right, where we had to make an active effort to bring more women in. And we actually, when we started the diversity inclusion team, that when we sort of started taking that over from Google, as opposed to just relying on the sort of big mothership to do those kind of things, we decided to focus on women for two reasons. So one is there was already a strong employee resource group. So the women of X who had kind of self-organized and were running events and supporting each other and so on. So there was like existing momentum. But we also realized that we weren't getting the leadership pipeline through. So we had a lot of people who started, but then like many other tech companies, women would drop out mid-career for a variety of reasons, but partly because they didn't see themselves in the leadership. And so they didn't think that they could make that step to director or VP and so on. So I agreed with Astro that we would have to like both promote more internally and build leadership programs specifically for women to help them get up that ladder, as well as hire some inspiring women from the outside, so that you would see a technical woman at VP level in the leadership team. And actually, just before I left, we did the same thing again. Like I helped him sort of diversify his leadership team again. And I hired a white woman, a Black woman, and an Indian woman. So I felt like that was a great legacy for like me to leave.
Are they still there?
Yes. Well, they just started sort of like
because you just left
in the summer. Exactly.
Right,
I just left.
Right.
So you have to make an active effort to change these numbers. Like it doesn't just happen by itself.
Is that what led you into the sort of mentoring aspects of nurturing?
It did. It did. Well, partly because, I mentioned two women who helped me in my career. So like I have definitely had great women and men who have sponsored me at particular points in my career, who not just sort of gave me a little bit of advice, which is I think what a mentor does, but actually actively advocated for me and said, like, you should hire this woman. Like Megan called Astro and said, you need someone like Obi. She's like launched a lot of stuff into the world. You can't just keep the stuff in the lab. It needs to get out, right? And so that I felt like an obligation and an honor to like give back to the next generation. So that's part of my motivation for sure. And part of it is like, you have to tip the scales. Like, you have to sort of, in order to achieve equality, there's no way that it would just happen by itself. And the men are very supportive, but they also want help, right? So like, I probably have spent as much time with men helping them how to be great sponsors and mentors of women as I have with the women themselves. And I think that part is sometimes overlooked, but incredibly important.
But you found in general more receptivity, not resentment to this nurturing of
Yes.
diversity.
I mean, in general, I think it's now, this is actually, so I've been in Silicon Valley for 9 years. When I first arrived, I was kind of shocked by how bad things were here. Because I came from London, right, where the tech industry doesn't dominate. So you would see lots of women, you know, running broadcasters, running the country, right? Like both Germany and the UK had had chancellors and prime ministers. And then I came here and the women were just so much less visible. Like, and I do think in the last 9 years, a lot has changed. And part of what has changed is the attitude, is that like something like Uber, for instance, in the early days under Tahir-Kheli, I can't imagine a tech company like sort of so blatantly being misogynist anymore. Like, I think people just wouldn't be able to get away with it anymore. So that's like real change that has happened in the last 5 years or so. But so when I arrived here, you know, I would have described myself as like a latent feminist. Like, of course I was a feminist. Of course I believed in equality. I kind of took it for granted. And I never felt that I was held back, even though, you know, I was just reminiscing with Kaz about our time when I started my career in consulting. I think I was the second female consultant in the firm.
How many?
The second. There was 40 consultants, and I was the second woman that they hired. And so what did I do? I volunteered to run graduate trainee hiring and like really focused on getting some women in because I didn't want to stay, you know, one of the few female consultants. But it never sort of occurred to me that it might be holding me back. I just sort of ignored it, I guess. In retail too, you know, I was 10 years younger than everyone else on the management team in the retail I worked with, where I was head of e-commerce and the only woman. There was one, she got fired, then it was just me. But it didn't sort of, it wasn't as obvious to me as when I came here. And that's when I became much more of a sort of, you know, overt feminist and said, we need to do something about it. Because here it's so dominated by the tech industry that all women see is technology companies. And if they're all run by men, or, you know, white people and, you know, Indian people for that matter, it's like, I think if you're Black, it's even more sort of, you see even less of yourself in the high echelons of tech companies. So that's why I became more activist, I suppose.
So if you were to offer advice to the young and upcoming people with sort of an inclination and talent to go into the technology fields and so on, what would you say are the 3 most important things if they're students looking to a career path?
Yeah. So one is, don't believe people when they tell you cliches, like you will never get a job at this degree, for instance, you know, do something you're really passionate about. I would say the most single important lesson I would give my younger self would be to ask for help more. And this is maybe because I was working in these fields where there's so few women. I constantly felt I had to prove myself and I had to sort of pretend that I knew how to do it. I actually remember my first day in consulting and I had never used Excel. And like all the other people who had done like, you know, engineering and management degrees, obviously had used Excel. I had a philosophy and psychology degree and I'd used statistics packages, but not Excel. And so to kind of like get over and ask the guy next to me, a guy, of course, like how to use Excel was hard for me. He's still one of my best friends. So it was worth asking him for help. And that is then as I got older and more senior, that kind of not asking for help actually backfired. Because there's this point where in a woman's career, I think when you become more influential and more powerful, and if you give off this sort of this aura of like, I've got this, you know, I don't need you, etc., it can actually backfire on you quite a lot.
In what ways?
Well, that people, so one is you don't get any help, right? So you're having to do a lot more on your own than you should be doing. But the second thing is like, it doesn't endear you to your peers. So your bosses might be impressed that you're so incredibly high achieving, but like your peers sort of think like, why does she think she can do it all by herself, right? And so actually when I started asking for help, especially for my peers, but also for my team, right? Like I started being much more open with my team when I didn't know how to solve a situation. And guess what? They would come up with great ideas for it, right? Then that was much better than when I pretended I had it sort of all under control. And it changed my relationship with my peers, especially. Like I felt much more connected to them and I got a lot more help. So, you know, it was like a more pleasant way of existing. So I think that would be that would be my number one piece of advice is like, don't be shy to ask other people for help. The psychology behind it is actually quite interesting, is that if you ask someone for help and they help you, they feel invested in you and they are going to do more in order to help you succeed than if you hadn't asked them in the first place.
Which is different from the perception one has that if you're female in a mostly male-dominated field, if you ask for help, it can be perceived as weakness. What you're saying, it isn't actually.
Yes.
It's quite the contrary.
Yes, it takes a certain amount of confidence in order to be able to ask the stupid question, right? So for instance, once I was the manager or leader in the company, I would make a point about asking the questions that were the dumb questions, because I could get away with asking the dumb questions. And I cannot tell you the number of times that you could see the sort of sense of relief in the room. Thank God someone asked that question, because I didn't know what that acronym meant or like how this particular process works or anything like that, right? And people just pretended that they do. But this kind of paradox of things that are perceived as weakness, like one of my favorite writers on this is Brene Brown, who's written extensively, researched and written on vulnerability. And, you know, vulnerability is, she says, it looks like weakness and it feels like weakness to you, but actually it's a sign of strength. That if you're able to be vulnerable with people, that takes a lot more strength and a lot more courage than pretending you're okay.
That's a good takeaway. The Google X was your most, the lengthiest exposure to this technology that you're now evolving into something different. What would be your sort of important kind of takeaways, lessons from this period in your career where you were right at the heart of innovation?
Right. Well, I think I shared some of them, like the importance of learning from failure, right? I mean, for me personally, it was a chance to work with really extraordinary engineers and other team members. Like in the beginning, it was mostly an engineering team. Now, you know, they have marketing and legal and policy teams and so on, like all the components that actually go into making a successful technology project or moonshot. So I would say that's like the thing that I will remember is all the extraordinary people I worked with. And I'll share another thing with you, which is another sort of vulnerable piece, which is during that time, I started managing engineers again. And I had managed engineers like very early in my career when I was at eToys. But at Google, like the engineers were like on the top of the pile, right? Like product managers, marketing, everyone else was like further down, sales somewhere, like in the nether regions. And so
because they had the ideas or because they could create, or
yes, because they could create and because it was a very technically led company, right? So it was all built on technical insights, and it was run by two engineers. You know, Larry and Sergey were engineers. And so when I first started managing engineers, the first engineer that reported to me was this guy who was a little bit older than me, and I obviously didn't have an engineering degree. And so he's like, who is this woman that is now going to be my boss? You know, he was not happy about it. So I spent the first meeting I had with him just asking about like what his problems were and like what the obstacles were that were lying in his way. And not a single thing he mentioned was a technical issue. Like everything he mentioned was, you know, the legal team doesn't do our contracts on time. This team is trying to steal our ideas. You know, that person is like being really difficult in the team and so on. And so I sort of sat there and I was like, I think I can help you with that stuff. You know, and one of my engineers that worked with me, he actually called it social engineering. He said, Obi, you're really, really good at social engineering. We can do the technical stuff, but you can do the social engineering. So I always made sure that they had a technical mentor so that if they did have technical questions, they could go to someone who wasn't me. But I've realized that a lot of the management had nothing to do with it. And I actually think I was a better manager to engineers than I had been to consultants or to marketing people or to product people, because I couldn't do their job. Right? I couldn't go into the code and check it. So I had to rely on asking difficult questions and inspiring people and so on. Whereas in all those other roles, I always sort of in the back of my mind, you know, you sort of think, oh, maybe I could just rewrite that copy and that would be a lot better, which is of course not true at all, right? You just have this illusion that if you've done the job before, you could do it better than the person sitting in front of you.
Going forward into your new venture, what kind of timelines are you working on? I mean, this is it's quite amazing what you're trying to do. And you're clearly used to impossible problems. So, but what would be a good scenario for?
What would be a good scenario? Well, I think I'm operating on two different timelines. So on one hand, bringing better mental health to millions of people will take a long time because this is an intractable systems problem. Like the way we set up a whole mental health system makes it actually very difficult for people to achieve good mental health. And there's many, many different aspects in that system. So ranging from just the way the health part works, which is we only focus on acute cases, like we wait until someone's gotten really ill until we get them treatment. Before that, we put them on a waiting list or we tell them there's no availability, right? That's like a bizarre way of dealing with health that exists in some areas of physical health, but is particularly bad in mental health. And it's not going to get any better anytime soon because there aren't enough therapists and psychiatrists and clinical psychologists and so on. And we can't train them fast enough to deal with the demand. So one part is the sort of health part of it. The other part is that, there are certain aspects of the way our society runs that is just making people more ill. And so that means we have to kind of rethink how fast-paced are our careers. Should Stanford be giving 24-hour essays to students? Because if you don't sleep well, that's a great recipe for making someone's mental status a lot worse. So there's kind of intractable problems that I will not be able to address at all. So the piece that I've chosen to address with my company is about empowering the individual with their own data so that they can understand themselves better and getting them help that is outside the sort of traditional system. And I really believe that peer support is a scalable way of empowering people to help each other that can be very, very effective. And it's been demonstrated in many places, ranging from like Zimbabwe to New York City, that it can be effective. So then to get back to your timescale question, because we're building a software product, we were actually able to launch the first beta prototype in 3 months, which was incredibly refreshing for me to be back in software, like having spent 9 years working on hardware where it takes a long time, right? You can't just like throw a self-driving car out in 3 months. Like it takes years to even have a prototype that you'd feel vaguely confident putting on a road. And even then our prototypes would have like 2 safety drivers in the front to make sure that the car didn't do something untoward. And so that speed of being able to launch a product, get the feedback, we have a feedback button in the app that's being used a lot, and sort of seeing what people think is really like the most fun piece for me. And being back in that kind of faster pace has been really, really great.
It's exciting. I just was thinking as you were speaking, well, are there issues with receptivity? Do you find, because it's new, marrying technology to age-old problems, as Condi mentioned. So is there a kind of skepticism that this is a new thing and therefore not necessarily trustworthy or effective? Or do you find that the need is so great that people are actually awaiting some new solutions and possible assistance in handling important mental health issues?
That's a great question. And the answer is both. So it depends who you speak to. So part of the reason why we want to do a study is because we do have to prove the effectiveness of a tool like this.
Right.
And I also think that's just both more ethically responsible thing to do, as well as, I want to know that it's effective before I take it out more broadly into the world. But on the other hand, there's also a lot of recognition that the existing tools that we have aren't good enough, and that we need to get more tools into the hands of people in order to make a kind of lasting change, to make transformative change. And we've chosen to focus on the consumer end because I think there's pretty much nothing that enables consumers to measure their own mental health apart from very basic mood diary apps. But the clinician end also, there's a lot of space still for innovation. But then this is where our user research was so interesting that we did on Amber, that we talked to clinicians of all different stripes, right? And some of them were very receptive to it and said, I want technology to help me be a better clinician. I want these tools. And others were completely against it. One psychiatrist I interviewed said, well, why would I need like your fancy brain hat to tell me how depressed this person is? Like, I can kind of tell the minute they walk into my office, you know, I've been doing this for 40 years and so on. So it's almost like the more accomplished and the more like more on the mental health professional side people were, the more skeptical they were about the new tools.
Why do you need change if it's working? But it's not.
Well, it was working, I guess, for them in their own practice, but not, I think, for the system as a whole, right? And you arguably, I mean, I don't think technology, you know, AI is never going to replace any doctor or clinician, but doctors who use AI are going to replace doctors who don't use AI. So I think that's kind of like often misunderstood. And the way papers are published, for instance, are often like, this machine can do the job better than a doctor. I think that's completely misguided. It's not about replacing any human. It's about giving the human superpowers and using technology as a lever that allows them to do a better job. And or get back to the pieces of the job that they enjoy, right? So like, who wants to spend a chunk of the visit with the person that they're seeing, whether it's, you know, a therapist or a psychiatrist, like trying to figure out what's been going on in the last few months? You know, it's not a good productive use of that hour. Like, what if instead you could look at a report together and go, oh, looks like, you know, Tuesday a week ago, something happened, like what was going on then?
Right.
And the students were much more open to it because, of course, there's a power dynamic between, for instance, the therapist and the student, where the students often felt very disempowered. And they also found that question of, how are you? And how have you been in the last week since I've seen you? Difficult to answer, because that's not how human memory works. Like, you know, there's huge recency bias. We can remember the last 24 hours. We can remember a salient event, like I had a really bad time last Tuesday, maybe. But to like ask us to do an average over the last 2 weeks of our mood or our sleep or our appetite is actually, that we know from psychology studies, that's not how memory works. So, but that's exactly what the clinical questionnaires of today do. They ask you to do an average of the last 2 weeks, which I personally just think doesn't work particularly well. Whereas if you're asking people in the moment, they can give a pretty accurate assessment. You know, you wake up in the morning, you can self-assess your mood much better than if you're supposed to do an average. Machines are much better at doing averages than humans.
Well, thank you. I think it's time to open up to questions. We have a person audience, but we also have a virtual audience. So I am going to rely on our colleagues who are listening in on questions on the virtual side, but could start with somebody in the audience. There's a microphone there. Please go up there, or I guess walk up to the microphone to ask your question if there's any in-person question here.
Hi, Ms. Felten. Thank you for being here. My name is Tanvi Gupta. I'm in the Masters in International Policy program here. And what you said about, you know, women in the workplace really resonated with me. At my previous employer, I was kind of grappling with whether or not to institute a professional development program for women. And I think the big questions that we were grappling with was, on the one hand, yes, for women that are just joining the company, you want to make sure that they have the skills to get to the top. But the flip side of that, in a patriarchal work environment, is that what is the perception of that? And we found that it actually made women seem more weak, that they didn't have the skills needed, that they needed more help in the workplace. And then the future conversations were, you know, she's being promoted because she's a woman, she's going through this program because she needs additional help. So now that you're at the helm of your company, how do you grapple with those two, and how do you make sure that you're creating a culture that, you know, where these questions don't necessarily come up, but also, if that is unavoidable, how do you grapple with those two extremes? Yeah.
Well, my company right now is tiny, so I'm not grappling with these problems at all yet. But let me ask it from my experience at X, which is where we did make this leadership development program called Thrive. Those things did come up, right? Like, why are we doing something special for the women? Is that even fair, etc.? And I said, well, you know, sure, let's only do it until we have like equity, right? Like if we have as many women in leadership positions as we have men, we can stop the program, right? And the second thing is we made the program really attractive, and we really heavily involved the managers and the skip level managers. So it'd be like the leadership that was reporting directly to Astro. And the way we did that is we actually made the program small. So it was only 12 women. And we said they have to be nominated by their manager or their leader. And so the first thing that did is it actually surfaced the numbers to those leaders. And some of them realized they had no women in senior leadership positions in their teams, which then they'd just never really paid attention to it before. The second thing is they all became really competitive because we didn't do a kind of perfect allocation of like each team gets 2 people. We basically said there's 12 slots, put your best women forward, right? So I had leaders like pitching me on like why they should be getting this woman into the program, including one who didn't have anyone at the level just below director. And they said, this woman's super talented. I'm sure she's going to get promoted in the next year, like so that she would be in that bracket that we were targeting. And so we took her into the program and she did get promoted. The promotion question, I personally like think it's pointless to even like argue about that because traditionally the promotion rates for women have been lower. So again, it's kind of one of those things where until we get to equity, like I don't really mind if we're helping some people to get promoted. And we're not doing it directly. It's not like we're tipping the scale when the promo committee is having the discussion, right? The place we're tipping the scale is where we're equipping the women with the skills that enables them to do great work. And then the great work gets them promoted, right? There's a similar thing on recruiting. Like people often say like, well, we can't make diversity hires. Of course not. We should not be making diversity hires. But can we tip the scale on the interview slate so that out of 10 candidates we interview, 8 of them are diverse? Yeah, absolutely. And so that's where you can make the difference, not at the end of the process. It's too late at the end of the process. You have to influence it further upstream. And then that's much less controversial as well.
Thank you.
Yes.
Hi, Ms. Felten. Thanks for joining us. So my name is Omar. I'm an international policy student here, graduate level. And I really enjoyed your talk. And I loved when you were talking about kill criteria. So I'd be really interested to hear what was your kill criteria when you came up with this idea for this app and this new company. And how did you overcome it? Because obviously, I think it's an awesome idea and you're going to be successful. And how do you look towards the future now? Is there other kill criteria still out there?
Yes, absolutely. Great question. So I have several kill criteria. So for HAP, one is it actually useful to people and do they want to use it, right? So retention data, once we have, like right now we have a small number of users, but once we have more users, like how many of them continue to use the app versus like stop using it, which by the way, the record's terrible. Like most mental health apps, it's less than 10%, get used after a while. So that's one question is like, is it actually adding value for people using it? That I would say is the most important thing because until you have a good product, everything else is unimportant. But then there's also business ones. So my hypothesis on the business model is I'm trying to sell it to universities and make it available for free to the students. That's turned out to be really hard. It takes a long time. It's incredibly bureaucratic. Lots of people get involved and so on. I've also never done enterprise sales before. So first I thought I just was terrible at enterprise sales. And then I spoke to other edtech entrepreneurs and said, no, the sales cycles to university is like 6 to 18 months. So it's not just me. But if I can't sell it, that would be like another kill criterion because that's a strong signal from the market that maybe this is not interesting. So it's both, when you have a complicated system like this, where the end user isn't necessarily the same as your customer, you have to sort of look at both of them. And then we have lots of like smaller ones. So because those are kind of longer arcs, right? So we wouldn't find out until maybe, years from now, whether it's working or not. There's much more kind of little ones, like do people use this particular feature? Like, do they understand this in user research? Should we be just tweaking the way we're asking the questions or the way the slider works? Like, how can we speed up the app? So there's lots of those kind of smaller things that we can measure and make it better too.
Before we take another one in person, is there a virtual question that we can take? And please just hold on at the microphone here for a minute, and then we'll come back to you.
All right, go ahead, please.
Thank you very much. My name is Miku Yamada. I'm also a Master of International Policy here. And my question is, as a junior female starting out in the workplace, I often grapple with situations where I feel that I need to understand what other people, to get to the level of their knowledge before I can make a suggestion or question that is relevant. And based on your experience of working in tech firms and bringing your very different perspective to the field, have you ever grappled with that? Like managing a team with engineers and not having that engineering background, did you ever feel that you kind of needed to catch up with what they're seeing, or how did you become more confident in your perspective and your experience in as an asset to that team?
So first of all, I would say in most of the rooms I've been throughout my career, I would usually be the person who knew the least about the subject matter. Right? Like if you think about it, there's always someone, at least one other person, like often with me, it was the entire room knew more than me. And so accepting that is a little bit like that Edison quote, like accept that you're just never going to be the best expert. In academia, I think people get very obsessed with being the expert because that's sort of how academia works, right? You narrow down, you become more and more and more and more expert. I'd say in business, it's not necessarily like that, right? I was a generalist my entire career. I sometimes joke that I was a general manager when I was 28, when I was too young to be a general manager, and I sort of grew into the role of general manager over time, right? So just assume that the other people don't actually know that much either, and they might just be pretending. That's like one thing you can do. The second thing is you do need to get enough of an understanding so you can make informed decisions, for instance. So if I don't understand the technology, I can't manage a technology project. That doesn't mean I need to be an engineer, but I need to have enough of an understanding so that I can apply some of these principles. Same thing with legal, right? I'm not a lawyer, but I can read a contract, or I can read a balance sheet, right? Even though I don't have a finance degree. So just getting to kind of a particular, like a base level of competency so that you can have an informed conversation is important. And the fastest way of doing that is ask others for help. So engineers, for instance, love nothing more than explaining their favorite piece of technology or the thing that they're working on to you. So every time I would start a new project, I would sit the team down one by one, and I would just like they'd stand at the whiteboard and they would explain stuff to me. Now, when a lot of the projects I managed at X were heavily physics and chemistry based, and I did a year of physics and a year of chemistry in high school and never did it again at university level. So that was hard. Like literally the team would have to explain the laws of thermodynamics to me multiple times when I was working on Malta, and it was kind of tedious for them. So when I then did the neuroscience project, it was like a breath of fresh air. I could read the papers and actually understand them, right? So there is, of course, going to be areas where you might be more out of your depth and less out of your depth. I would just keep coming back to the point, like, don't pretend that you know it, and just like admit when you don't know it and where your limitations are, right? Because my lawyer, when they're discussing a contract with me, they're not expecting me to have legal knowledge. That's their job, right? They're bringing that to the table. What I'm doing is assessing the business risk of the legal risk that they're presenting to me.
Yes, is there a virtual question?
Oh, sorry, I have an in-person one. Hi, my name is Cody. And I actually work with Manpreet Singh.
Great.
We do research together on mental health in China, actually. And she's mentioned great things about your app, and she's very excited to evaluate it. And I was really wondering, I guess, what has the feedback for the app been so far? I've taken a look at it, and you mentioned it's been tried in Zimbabwe, I think, or is that another?
No, that's another. The thing I was referring to with Zimbabwe is called Friendship Bench. If you Google it, you can find it. That was a great peer support system that was set up by Zimbabwean psychiatrists, because I think there were 10 psychiatrists in Zimbabwe. So we're borrowing these principles from evidence-based work. But as I said, the particular thing that we're working on is new, right? So the feedback is super early days. People are excited about the concept, particularly this combination of self-tracking, of kind of empowering you with your own knowledge, but then also using that tracking data in order to share it with some supporters and getting the help from the support, because as I said, that's novel in mental health. But I would say it's way too early to say that it, that it definitely will work, or that that people will continue to use the app, etc. Part of the reason we're adding in the wearable data is so that there's passive tracking, and people don't, if they forget to fill in the questionnaire, for instance, it's okay because we have this other data stream, and also because some of the data, like sleep, is more difficult to self-assess than, say, mood, for instance. So I'd say I'm cautiously optimistic, but it's super early days.
And do you have any particular hypotheses regarding, certain subgroups of people who may benefit more than others in the evaluation?
Well, we picked students mostly because the need is so high, 40% of students having mental health issues, but also because they're so much more open to technology, and a third of them already have wearables. So that's the first group. But people have talked to us about, could we use this in postpartum, for instance, which is very difficult to assess, very difficult to disambiguate between, is this just hormones of people coming down after the pregnancy? Is this just sleep deprivation, right? Because you have a new baby, or is this actually something that needs to be treated? And it often gets treated way too late, which has really detrimental effects both on the mother and the baby. So there's many other groups. I mean, healthcare workers, people keep saying like, well, you did Heroes Health, why couldn't you use app for healthcare workers? So I think there's many groups, but we're a small startup, so we have to start somewhere. So we just picked a focus that we thought was most promising based on the research that we've done so far.
Thanks so much.
The virtual question, please. And then afterwards, hang on a minute. Yes.
This is a two-part question. Building small communities to support each other is a great idea. How do the mental health professionals map onto this and support people? And then the second part of the question is that so many mental health issues are dealt with by pharmaceuticals, which in many cases is the first response, and the pharmaceuticals may exacerbate the problems. How do you work with the pharmaceutical industrial complex?
Okay, so I actually think those two questions are related. So I don't see peer support as a replacement for either professional help. There's some people who definitely need professional help. I see it as an adjunct. So it's something that you can have on an ongoing basis, but say therapy or pharmaceutical treatment is something that you need during certain periods, right? So mental health, people go through these waves. They go through ups and downs in their lives. They have episodes, and that might be recurring, right? So if you are ill, like if you're actually meeting criteria for severe depression, you need therapy, and you very likely need medication, right? There's some mental illnesses like schizophrenia and bipolar where you definitely need medication. Like people come off their meds have really bad outcomes. So I don't think this is like a medication versus other things. Like what we actually need to get much better at is, instead of just prescribing a very basic formula, which is like, we try this kind of medication. If that doesn't work, then we try these other four. And it's like literally a trial and error approach. One of my interviewees, another psychiatrist, he said it's like throwing spaghetti at the wall, is how he described it. So we just need to get much more nuanced about like what works for whom and when. So that temporal aspect, that people might need certain types of treatment during some periods in their life and other types of treatment during another period of life, I think is really underrated. And we're so far away from any kind of personalized medicine in mental health compared to other fields where we're a little bit more advanced, like in cancer, where that idea has taken hold that that's something we should be striving for. So to me, it's a combination. And the way that peer support can be, you could either look at it as like a base layer of support that's always there, right? And then you layer other levels of support on top. Or you could even see it as helping somebody navigate what's often a very bewildering array of options, right? Like, should I be going to, like, which kind of doctor should I be going to? Do I even need to see a doctor, or should I be doing meditation, right? I mean, that is like the breadth of the questions that people ask themselves. So to have a peer that maybe has had mental health problems in the past and has navigated some of that can be incredibly helpful. And if you look at like a subset, if you look at substance abuse and addiction, peer support is the only game in town, right? 12-step programs run by volunteers are the most effective way of treating substance abuse. So there, I would argue, medication is like a tiny, tiny part of what matters. And peer support is kind of the main idea, but in many, many other areas in mental health, it's not.
Final question. Yes.
Hi, Ms. Felten. I just wanted to say really enjoyed the talk. And I'd actually like to circle back to your experience at Google X. And particularly, I was curious about how Google X and how during your time managing the team, you went about creating the culture of Google X and how you made it a place where it was okay to think about moonshots, to really go deep into those ideas and care about them and bring them to the team and have those ideas be taken seriously and be taken with the credence that they could become something that's meaningful to millions of people.
Yeah. Wow, that's a big question to end on. I mean, I believe that it's all about culture. Right? People sometimes think the impediment to innovation is lack of funding or existing structures. It's all about the culture, and the culture works at multiple levels. So it can work at a small team level. So a team can decide to change the way they're approaching the way their team runs, right? And then it works at a company level. So for instance, when we made decisions about promotions, that you can't do that at a team level. So a very kind of practical example there might be, if we want to make sure that people aren't becoming too risk adverse, like how can we incentivize them to actually take some of those risks and know that failure isn't going to backfire on them? So for instance, Kathy, who ran the Foghorn project, she was going up for promotion just after she shut the project down. And we had the conversation. She said, well, should I wait till I've done the next project? And I said, no, you can go now. Just write she had written a really great postmortem on the project. And she actually ended up putting that as her #1 achievement in her promotion packet. And the committee discussed it and decided that it was of merit, and she got promoted. So those are the kind of things where you can change the culture in a kind of a practical way, right? At a company level. But then there's also things that you do at a team level. So for instance, the psychological safety of a particular team, like do people feel heard? Do they feel they can kind of voice an opinion that's different from the rest? Can they challenge the manager? All those things you can do at a team level. So an example from my last team from Amber was we had been working for quite some time on building a depression machine learning model based on a data set that we'd licensed from some researchers. So it was an academic data set. And the model just was producing okay results, but not great. And then one day, one of the really junior people on the team, we'd hired her as a PhD intern and then converted her. She came to me and she said, the reason we're not getting great results is because it's an anxiety data set. Most of the people in this data set actually have anxiety issues, not depression. And I said, really? And she said, yes. And she went bright red because she thought, oh my God, I've just told my boss that that's all a disaster. We're never going to be able to get these results, et cetera. So I said to her, what do you think we should do? And she said, well, I think we should run the model with anxiety labels and see how well it does. And so I said, that's a great idea. And we ran it and we got really good results. Now, what was interesting about that is she was really worried about telling me initially because she thought I would sort of, punish her or say, this is terrible. And we've been working on this for months. Why did no one tell me before? I did say that, but not to her. But actually the outcome was really positive because there's a huge overlap between depression and anxiety. To have a model that can detect both is orders of magnitude more interesting than a model that can only detect one of the two. So she actually did us a huge favor by broadening the scope of the project to both. And so I made a really big deal of that. I told everyone the story, I talked about it, I gave it frequently as an example of where someone, came up and did something that was kind of contrary to what the team had been working on in her mind and how beneficial that was to the team. And so that's one of the things that you can do to encourage that kind of culture. Not punishing whistleblowers is another thing, right? So we just recently had some issues at Springer Nature and we had a whistleblower, and that you need to reward them, not punish them. So there's a lot of things that you can do. And then the final thing I would say is dealing with failure, there's always grief involved. And when I realized how emotional it is, and and gave more space to that emotion. That was another thing that I think we did uniquely at X that I've never seen in any other company. And the way it manifested itself was we actually celebrated the Day of the Dead. And this is an idea from two Latinas in my team who came to me, and one of them is a coach, and she said, Gina Rudin is her name, and she said, look, there's so much grief in the building, like people like shutting down these projects and, you know, things not working all the time. We got to deal with the grief. And so she proposed that we celebrate Dia de los Muertos, and she organized this whole ceremony. So there was an altar, there was shaman, there was drummers, and so on. And it was a very serious ceremony. And what happened was people would put their prototypes on the altars, but they also brought pictures of loved ones, just like in a traditional Dia de los Muertos ceremony. And so it's just like this really cathartic, you know, day where people like mourned things they'd lost that year, and that enabled them to move on in a way that I think is otherwise very difficult. If you just always shove everything under the carpet, you can't deal with it. So that kind of emotional piece and being able to talk about it at work, right, which most people do not do. They don't talk about negative emotions like grief, anger, fear, etc. at work was, I think, a huge shift in the culture.
Thank you, Obi, for the breadth of the conversation and for being here. Thank you for adding your name to the Women Who Inspire lecture series. We'll stay in touch and we'll follow and see how your venture goes, and wish you all success. Thank you to the audience, both present here and virtually. I'd like to conclude this particular session of the Women Who Inspire lecture series and look forward to the next one. Thank you all very much.